Okay, hello everybody. My name is Lucie Lederhendler. Welcome to the AGSM main gallery where we're hosting Black Prairies, curated by Alyssa Fearon up until November 30th. We are today representing Treaties 1 and 2. The AGSM, of course, is located on Treaty 2 territory, which is the traditionally shared lands of the Cree, the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples. It's also the proud homeland of the Red River Métis. We are so happy to have Anna Binta here in person with us from Winnipeg today to talk about the exhibition, her practice, and specifically this piece, Frontiers, which is included in the show. Anna Binta Diallo is a multidisciplinary visual artist who explores themes of memory and nostalgia to create unexpected works about identity. She was born in Dakar, Senegal, grew up in St. Boniface, Manitoba, and lived more than 15 years in Montreal, Tchitchage, Munieng. She completed her BFA at the University of Manitoba's School of Fine Arts and received her MFA from the Transart Institute in Berlin. Her work has been exhibited widely in Canada and internationally and has been featured in biennales such as Momenta and Bamako Encounters. In 2022, she unveiled her first public artwork, a mural integrated into the architecture of the Espace Denis Sarrat in the Verdun Auditorium in Montreal. She is the recipient of several awards, prizes, and distinctions, notably from the Conseil des Arts et Lettres du Québec and the Canada Council for the Arts. In 2021, she was a finalist in the Salt Spring National Art Prize, awarded the Barbara Spohr Memorial Prize from the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre, and received the Black Designers of Canada Award of Excellence. These are busy years, it's a long bio. In 2022, she was longlisted for the Sobey Art Award. Her works are part of numerous public and private collections, including EQ Bank, RBC Royal Bank, and Scotiabank. She is currently an assistant professor at the School of Art at the University of Manitoba. Welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
Yes, thank you for having me today.
So that was the bio.
Yes.
Those were the points.
Yeah.
But tell us kind of the memoir version of that. How did you get started?
Sure. So yeah, I was born in Senegal. My mom is Franco-Manitoban from Winnipeg. My father is Senegalese, and they both met in France when they were both studying for their PhDs. And they immigrated, well, my father immigrated back to Winnipeg as my mom was offered a job teaching at the university, and he also started teaching at the university. And so they both were professors there, and I grew up here. I went to art school here, did my undergrad here, and then I moved to Montreal right after that. And then I was gone for 15 years, and I just returned back. And now I'm teaching at the School of Art as well. So that's kind of like the condensed, fast version. Yeah. And I've been interested in the arts since a very young age. It was always something that I was interested in pursuing, and I've been, finding ways to work in the arts and make work, exhibit work since I started studying the arts. Yeah.
And how long have you been working in this idiom? Because I think that this is immediately recognizable.
Yeah, so I've been working with collage for a long time. I'm a mixed media artist, so I worked in painting, video, and more recently, maybe around 2019, I started kind of thinking about collage in different ways that I hadn't used them before, or that I hadn't worked with that material in that way. And that started around 2019 when I was working on a body of work that was researching folklore and images from books, stories. And I started this body of work called Wanderings, which was trying to reconfigure images from these stories.
You're talking about kind of old original kind of like prints and
I was looking
etchings.
I was looking at not prints, or a lot of storybooks actually. Mm-hmm. So, and from different sources. So that's kind of how I worked. I worked on that project for a while, and then since then I've been kind of thinking that project was really, I guess, about the idea of folk stories and storytelling. And since then I've done different projects where I'm kind of narrowing the scope on a specific topic a little bit more. And this body of work, when I was asked to participate in this exhibition, I was thinking a lot about stories, but specific stories that I guess my father used to read when he was younger, and he told me this when I was growing up. He had this big box of comic books that he read about the West, Canada, And so this...
And when he was living in Senegal.
When he was living in Senegal.
Yeah.
And so when he finally moved to Manitoba, he said he had all these imaginations about what Winnipeg or Manitoba or the prairies would be like. And then so I actually have all those, I used a lot of those comic books to kind of look through them. And that's what this body work is about, is kind of thinking about the idea of going through, trying to imagine yourself, projecting yourself in a place, but also looking back on the place where you came from. So it's very much about, consuming images and imagining a place.
Yeah. I'm going to reset our view here so that people online can see a little bit more closely. And in the meantime, I'll say to anybody watching online that you can engage with us through the comment section. We'll be able to receive those. So here, let's have a seat, you and me. I'm seeing a lot of parallels between storybooks, right? Kind of children's literature.
Yes.
In the idea of what an illustration is versus a work of art, right? So
Right.
you're kind of dismantling. Those are violent words.
Yeah.
But like how it transfigures from an illustration into by decontextualizing, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think for me, I'm trying to take apart the whole and like reconfigure it in a way. And so I'm drawn to specific like moments in the story or in the image, and try and find connections to the character I'm trying to bring to life. But I'm trying to tell stories individually in each of the characters, but also as a whole, so that you can walk through it and see that there is a transition.
Yeah.
But there's also a connection between each of the characters. Yeah.
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 So we want to read frontiers kind of left to right, but also kind of from the center outwards, right?
Exactly. I think that's a good point. I think it could be left to right. It could also be this way, and it could also be from the central figure that way. And I did conceive it more as like a in the past and in the future kind of, or maybe what I'm reading about and what we're thinking. What the central figure is actually like supposed to be an imagination of my father reading these books, these comic books.
Right.
So
Let's
he's the central figure. That's kind of like the middle figure, kind of ripping through this comic book, but it's also the imagination, and it's also my implied. The characters on the left are really about places like characters that would inhabit the Senegalese landscape, so to speak. Whereas these ones are maybe some of these comic books that talk about the prairies and like cowboys and Indians, like shooting stories, and like the frontiers. So these are the comic books that he was reading, and that like fed his imagination about what the prairies or what Canada was like.
Are these literally the comic books that you found them?
So I work a lot with found images, but in order to, I want to respect copyright laws.
Right.
And I think I could use some of them as a fair use. So I did use them as a way to jumpstart the project, but I'm able to kind of find other images that replicate what I was looking for without falling into that idea of like taking these artists, these other artists, these comic book artists, their work.
Right.
So these are all images that I know I'm able to remix them without that, they're in the Creative Commons.
Right.
Yes.
Because it looks like you can tell from the dot printing
Yes.
in some of them.
Yeah.
That's very 25-cent comic book, but then looks like watercolor advertising.
Yes, there's a bit of both.
Yeah.
There's a bit of, I like to mix the images so they're not all from the one source.
Yeah, and the difference in textures is really, so this is something about the decal technique
Yeah.
makes these collages actually look kind of subtractive.
Right.
rather than your,
Yeah.
your cut out sculptural
Exactly.
pieces, which
Yeah.
are the opposite. And you're doing collage, but you're doing it digitally with material objects.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of decision, and then blowing everything up
Yes.
to enlarge it,
Yes.
which I think is really an important part of the decontextualization,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So as you're playing around with it, how much are you, when you said you found the images that you kind of needed to complete the picture?
Yeah, well, I was really looking into, I really wanted to think of these like kind of, in all these stories, you'll see the same type of archetype, I guess. You'll see like a man riding a horse, or this person kind of like strolling through, and there's violence, there's like all these, this one is kind of like more of an explorer or a trapper. And these are all characters in these books. I was going to bring them actually today, and I forgot them, just to show like some of the images that are found in there.
Yeah.
So it was, for me, it was kind of just like giving a glimpse of like these archetypes that you'll find in these comic books without necessarily like showing us those characters. Because I think the outline of the silhouettes kind of signify that in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we glossed over that your dad is also quite mythological because he was the first Senegalese man.
Right. Well, so
let's take his word for it.
I mean, he says, I think I was probably one of the first Senegalese persons in Manitoba at the time. Like, I remember when we were young, he would say that, oh, I don't think there was anyone from Senegal here. Now there's lots. But I always remembered him saying that, and it kind of affected me because at the time it just reiterated how, yeah, as a visible minority, as a mixed heritage person growing up in Winnipeg, like I felt that growing up.
Right.
So I don't know if it's true, if it's an actual 100% claim to truth.
Yeah.
But I use that as a point of departure to make this work, as like an idea to think about like what it was like to come here, and then to also have this imagination of this place, and this curiosity. I think he had like I used to read about, he knew so much history about Manitoba and Canada and the West.
You quote it because you mean mythology.
Yeah. And he's like, oh, I saw, these characters. I think these comic books were in a way trying to talk about the history of this place, but in a comic book sort of way. So it wasn't always factual, and it was told from a colonial perspective. These artists that made these comic books are all from Europe, so they had a very like Eurocentric way of representing the prairies. But my father was very much.
Sorry, you mean Eurocentric as opposed to even like a homesteader perspective?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
So triply othered.
Exactly,
Yeah.
very much removed, I think. And so if you go through these comic books, you start to see like this exaggeration of all these things. So I kind of wanted to play with that idea that like, as an immigrant, my father already had a vision of maybe what it would be like, but then actually he ended up marrying a French Canadian from that area and moving here. So it was kind of like, I just wanted to play with this idea of like, what can you imagine a place to be and what it's like to actually be here. So yeah, those are things I was thinking about.
Yeah, and there's definitely something that's a little bit, it implies a bit of predestination because of the evidence of this fascination.
I wonder. I mean, he still has all these comic books, and there's like 3 big boxes of them, and I think he still enjoys reading them. I think it's something that's like, it was a mixture of adventure, history. I mean, it's like watching one of these Wild Wild West movies,
There's a bit
westerns.
of camp in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
for sure. And there is something we glossed over, but the idea of being a visible minority and the way that you have chosen such different indicators of identity in all of them, right? You've taken away skin color.
Yes.
You've taken away, hair texture. You've taken away all of these things, and replaced it with, I don't want to say propaganda, but a visual culture that maybe doesn't have to be interrogated as much as something like racism. Right,
exactly. Well, I didn't want it to be too, I wanted to like leave snippets of that in there, but not be too overt with the symbolism. Because yeah, as I was going through all these images, there was a lot of violence and a lot of racist imagery. And there was also comic books, like I keep talking about the West, but there are also comic books about Africa as well. So I did touch upon that as well. Like there's like all these, very kind of, it's not Tarzan, but it's like another character. There's all these like story plots that take place in Africa, and like who's the savior in these stories. So I was thinking about those as well, like that representation that happens, and how we consume that, and and how do we question it, and without representing all of it, because
we can contextualize it in the exhibition as
Sure.
well, where Alyssa Farron is pluralizing the history of the prairies by asserting a Black presence here.
Right.
Right. And she's done that with archival photographs incorporated with contemporary art. So when she asked you to be a part of this exhibition, obviously it's in line with the body of work that you have a sustained interest in. But for these specific places, as far as that pluralization, can you speak to that?
I think I was really interested in finding a way to tell a story that was like, because the Black Prairies is it's a vast topic, and the only way I could approach it was like from my own experiences or my own narratives without trying to say everything. So that's kind of how I approach it. And I saw all the other works in the show, and I think they like the plurality of the different experiences, the different people that were already here, the lost histories. I think that's all coming through in the show. And then there's also, the opportunity to continue a conversation. Like, I think looking back, because there's a lot of old, like there's some found images from Black folks living in the prairies. And I think it's a nice point to look back. And I also think it's nice to contextualize that with like, maybe more artists working today and their experiences. So having all that in conversation, I think, is it was very an exciting invitation to work with this exhibition theme.
Do you find that you are in dialogue with the specifically Black art history? I know we talked about your teaching a little bit, but at an international scope as well.
I think I've always, because I am a person of color, I'm Black, I'm a mixed person, I've always been interested in telling stories that relate to identity, because it was something that I was experiencing. And I think earlier on in my practice, I was really like trying to examine what that means for me personally and as an artist. So I did a lot of like work that was looking inwards, but I think as I made more work and explored other themes, I'm trying to link it to so it's universal as well.
Sure.
So there's an entry point, and I'm also looking at the different, like the kaleidoscopic experiences that people might have, and it's not always about, this work is about Blackness, because I don't believe that that's how I operate, but I think there will always be, it'll always be there somewhere because of the inherent nature of like, if you're thinking about something, it'll probably come through in the work in some way.
Whether or not it's being performed.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Can we go through them maybe one by one?
Sure.
Yeah, because you have titled all of them individually in addition to the meta title of Frontiers.
Yes.
And you said that you kind of titled them according to nicknames.
Well, they're not nicknames, but I'm gonna get the form. But I think the first one here is griot, which is someone in Senegal who they're known as people who almost like religious figures, where they hold stories, they for their community, they pass on the stories. So that one's called griot, or it's in French, so griot. I don't know if I can say it in English, actually.
It's okay.
And this one is called cavasade, which is two people riding on horseback. And because there's so many horses in this exhibit, I really want to kind of contrast like the cowboy that the image of the cowboy and of the West with like what you would maybe see in the streets of Senegal, in Dakar. And then the other one here is Cavalier. I thought of him more as like, yeah, like a noble king riding a horse. And again, I'm thinking more of these images have more, the imagery that I'm thinking about is like the comic books that represent this place. But I'm trying to recontextualize it by, yeah, I guess like there's huts, you can see some huts in there, there's a lion. So I'm trying to play with this idea that like, there's like this could be a character who might be portrayed as someone who's in a fight with somebody else or something like that. I don't know. I was just thinking about that.
This might be a good location to stop and address a question we have online, which is how you choose your collage materials specifically. So I'm going to zoom the camera in here to see how different all of these textures are. So you touched on, trying to address the variation in mythologies that this kind of low culture perpetuates.
Yes, yeah.
Right? That it has to be for a common denominator, right? It has to be kind of popular for popular consumption. But so where is the collage here? First, let's say that. How many pieces would you say these are?
I guess it's, there's different pieces here, there's a piece there. Like every compartment is kind of separated and the images are placed. But it's, I don't know, I do it intuitively, but I also do it, like I have a lot of images that I look at, and when I compose my images, I really think about like, what do I want to stand out? What do I want to hide? So the collages are like every single section has an image.
Because there's definitely like more modeling here than in other ones where you've gone for like specifically flat.
Yeah.
So this drapery, for example.
Right, yeah, exactly. There is drapery there. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but.
We'll keep talking about collage for sure.
Sure.
So this one, for example, you've specifically chosen to make one huge piece that flattens it, but it's also the largest piece in the series.
Right. Well, this one was the first one I made, and it was, like I said, the imagination of my father reading comic books, and like I was thinking about the 70s, like the big bell-bottom pants, and then reading about the prairies, reading about fishing, reading about bison hunts. So you'll see all that there. Yeah.
Majestic horse.
Yes.
Yeah. You've done like continuous pieces as well.
Yeah, I have done that.
Right? You did the same there. Yeah. And I'll zoom out real quick to show everybody what we were talking about when you can read it from the center out or left to right. So I keep picturing him kind of like the kid in Never-Ending Story. He's creating all of these things from his book, right? They're kind of emerging from his imagination.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then this lively, colorful horseback.
Yeah, this one's called Yeehaw, I think. Just like thinking about, I guess the West, the cowboy, the farm, I really wanted to have this kind of like, this idea of like the zebra is kind of in conversation with this pattern. But if you look more closely, or if you've seen the full image, you'll see that it's from a comic book where there's like probably like a war between an indigenous tribes and like a violent image, but I really want to kind of like take that out and just leave the hints of that story.
Yeah. Like with those really aggressive kind of colors and the poor printing quality and all of that. Yeah. And there's something kind of disjointed about this character. Right?
Yes.
It's usually because of this collage element here where he looks like cut up.
I mean, it's very, I think, I like to play with perspectives as well. I mean, like, is it his pants or is it his arm?
Right.
I wanted it to feel a little bit menacing. So that's kind of where I landed on that one. And there's like also the landscape back there. So I like to kind of play, with different perspectives of like the kind of the scenery, the people, but also like the codes of like what you might see as part of a whole image.
Yeah, and it definitely like the transition into this kind of flashier, more commercial, like kind of color palette. Yeah. So that's Yeehaw.
Yeah, and then this one I think is Saunters. Like I just thought of like, yeah, I thought of cinema as well. Like I talked about comic books, but I think this also lends itself to this idea of like what we see on screen. And there was a lot of movie posters that kind of dramatize this like the prairie life, the Western. So you'll see kind of a little bit of that in there. And yeah, I think I want to at least to show some of the characters' faces, just to kind of, I mean, I think that's what's very impressive with comic book is that like, you know, you see so many scenes that are happening, but I felt this one was more of like a slow down reflection scene, with someone that's kind of walking by, sauntering by.
And what's interesting about this one, I think, is that just because of our ability to like relate to faces, right?
Yeah.
Seeing those faces there dates it much more
Right.
than any of the other concepts, right? Because just the stylistic
Yes.
fashion
Yeah.
is
different.
something that can be read, as opposed to the mythology of the Old West.
Right.
Yeah. And then it kind of gets smaller.
It gets a bit smaller, and this one's
intimate.
It's called coureur, and I was thinking about like coureur de bois and the kind of voyager culture, because those were in those comic books as well. Like I think there was whole plots about that, and the people coming, the French coming from Quebec to work with the indigenous people here, or it's like all these wars that were happening, and I was thinking about like this kind of like exploring spirit, I suppose, and how that might have been taken as like an adventure, for example, like, oh, this is so exciting, but it's also history. So I was trying to play with that, and mention that this was a big part of the comic books as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they're kind of completely different genre.
Yeah.
From the saloon.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, they are.
Like they become wild.
Yeah.
They become feral.
Exactly.
Somehow. Yeah.
And I think the last one is called Neil, and I think I wanted to end it on, I don't know, something that was a bit more, like not turning his back on it, but like facing away, and then thinking about like the legacy of what these images can do, and then just the legacy of, that history, I guess, and that, I don't know, the violence in it, but also the way that it's perceived, almost like, I don't know, I'm having a hard time explaining it.
What I find so compelling about this final one, not just that it's so modest, and especially compared to the leftmost,
Right.
Is that that figure is addressing you, and this figure is staring at a reflection or drawing something in the sand. You know, there's something very, very pensive, internal, reflective about this posture from this simple outline that you've created, right?
Oh, yeah, well, interesting, thank you.
With these images of pretty extreme violence, right?
Right.
About this internal
Yeah, which is what all of these were full of.
Right.
And so it was like almost a challenge to not show any violence.
Yeah.
But I didn't think that it needed.
That's not the
that.
story.
That's not the story.
That's the story that he was reading.
Exactly.
But not the story
Yeah.
that he led. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think I've asked where the silhouettes come from.
So the silhouettes,
sketch those?
I do sketch them. I draw them by hand, and they're also also borrowed from images that I find. So the process, I have like a process where I find a character, a pose, or something, and then I draw them out, and then I think about how I want to collage it. So it's like a multi-layered process that I'm still like developing it and thinking about it. But I'm really drawn into the silhouette because of how much information it can contain in like the body movement or in the pose. And like you mentioned skin color earlier, and I like that collage kind of offers me that opportunity to kind of remove that so that it becomes more accessible and maybe offers a bit of curiosity as well into like what the story is here. So a way to dive into something without necessarily being told everything.
Right. I think it might have just been an R21 reel or something, but Alice Walker said the same thing about how she ended up with the collage. Because she kept drawing it, and she was doing white on black paper, and cutting it out, and then finally she flipped it over, and she was like, "That's it."
Karen Walker? Kara Walker?
Yes.
Okay, Kara Walker. Okay, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think I saw her work like when I did my undergrad at the Walker Art Center, and I remember being like blown away by that. And I didn't really think about that work like for a long, long time until I started working. You know, you kind of just do your thing for years and years, and then when I started, because I wasn't working with silhouettes until just recently.
Really?
Yeah, I was working with collage and bodies, but in a different way. And so this kind of became like a turning point for how I started doing some of this work. So of course I like remembered that Kara Walker she was obviously a huge influence. And like the history of like the black silhouette also has a very like a vernacular history, like that is connected to like black culture as well. Like I think in Harlem, they use the black silhouette for advertisements on like music and things like that. So there is already a history there. But I think there is like a lot of power in the silhouette. And I think the same thing happened to me where I was doing all these collages, but then as I was building them up and up, I was like, do I need all this extra stuff, or can I just like focus on this? And that's kind of how that happened. That's how it clicked for me in my process.
Yeah, cool. And so let's talk process.
Okay.
Like, these all have to be scanned or photographed or something before you play with them.
Yes.
What are you doing? How are you doing
I do all of it. Like I scan, I look at books. Like I'm kind of a collector. I like to collect a bunch of stuff, and that's usually how my process begins, is like I have an idea and I'm like, okay, I want to look at this, so I'll like gather an archive, and that's a combination of like physical archives, boxes of books, whether it's boxes of books or a bunch of maps, or old maps, and then I'll scan them and photograph them, and I also have, like I'll look online sometimes, or I'll go to the archives as well. So my process really always starts in this kind of analog way, because I like working with my hands.
Yeah.
And then I eventually have my like work project archive, which then I begin to work from there.
So that sounds like you're grounding everything, regardless of the concept, in history.
Yes.
In a fact-based history.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were talking when Alyssa was here for the lunch and look, which you can watch online. I'm not in this screen. We'll go over here. We were going over the fawns here, the Jamerson fawns, and like I said, there's notes on the back of everything, and really trying to think of the difference between curation and this kind of collecting is tricky, right?
Yeah.
It's really subtle, those differences, and it's just about self-identity. So the process of once you have all these things gathered and you're playing this game of similarities, right? That's the work of art.
Yeah. And I think even seeing these images there, like a lot of times I have been drawn to like these photos that are kind of lost in time, or the author is unknown, or so I've always been like curious about those, and I feel like my role as an artist is always to think about how can I like give this voice, this image, like another breath of life, I suppose, or another way to look at it, or another way to question how we look at those images and those kind of things. So there is like a responsibility there, and I try to. I'm always thinking about like the ethics of that, and that's why
things that were created by another person that had life given to them, and then they kind of are on pause.
Yeah, and if the photographer is unknown, and often the subject is unknown as well. So that's why I'm removing a lot of the specific identities of these people or the photos or where they come from. Yeah.
So that starts with ethical considerations, but then becomes hugely central to this work.
Yes.
Yeah. What are you collecting now?
So I'm trying to remember. I'm about to work on a new project now. I haven't started yet, but I'm thinking about it. And the idea is to think about light. I'm thinking a lot about light. My recent project, I was working a lot with maps, so that's kind of been my most recent project. I'm not working with silhouettes or characters necessarily, but I'm looking at how a map, the power of a map and how it can be deconstructed and reconfigured. So I've been thinking a lot about that and working with layers of information sculpturally and with light as well. So like light can come through them. So I'm still working with collage, but in a different way. And so I think my next like pivot, I think, will be thinking about once you cut something out, these perforations, like what does the light leave behind? So I don't know if I haven't started collecting yet, but that's where my practice is kind of heading just right now. Yeah.
Is there an original, like, when you say I haven't started collecting yet, do you, for myself, when I'm like, I feel like I should get really into this topic, things start to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You start to be like, yep.
Yeah, exactly.
You find something at a used bookstore and you go, okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And then eventually you go in earnest into the archives, into the...
Yeah, and I think for me, like every project is different. Like my approach, like how I work, I really try and I have kind of like a set of rules for each type of project. And this is a new one, so I don't have those rules yet.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. What were the rules for this one?
I mean, I just meant like I have I'll work with an archive and I'll have a theme and I'll like...
You'll limit yourself.
I'll limit myself and have some of these impositions. And like for the works that I did for topographies, it was really, I found or was given all these old maps, like very old maps. And that was like my archive that I was working for that project. So once the project is complete, I kind of move on to a different thing. But something always leads me to the next, right? So there's always a trace of the previous research that I was doing that will like interest me into something. So it's like it's still linked, but I then try and figure out a way to like follow that hunch or that interest into something, and then like you said, I'll probably start gathering things for that.
Yeah, things will reveal themselves.
Yeah.
Likely. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. That sounds great.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's very interesting. Yeah, and I love your sculptural work. Your
thank you so much.
Yeah. Because it really does feel, like I said, for some reason, these feel like we've cut holes into a surface and we're kind of peering through into this. And maybe that's because of the starting point being a young boy's imagination.
Right.
But that's really the sense that I get. And with the installations, the vitality of moving around something. I've never seen one in person. I'm just imagining.
Okay.
Which
is you mean a sculptural work?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I guess.
Yeah, and I mean I think there would the sculptural works also have their own way of like taking part of a story because they can be moved around. They can jump out, but for this work I really want it to be like this kind of flat, almost like a storybook,
right? And
flipping through the pages. But that's not to say that I couldn't imagine making one of these like a sculptural work. Yeah. So we opened by talking about kind of where illustration ends and the art practice begins. Yeah.
Like we're illustrating something, but like, is it something has to become more conceptual, or is it that the illustration has to become less literal? Are those irrelevant to the practice? And then I'm also wondering the same thing about collage. When you say like, I'm still doing collage, but like, how far can you push the practice and still call it collage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know that I have the specific answer to the second question, which was like, how far can you push it until it's collage? I don't know. I think collage is one of those terms that there's many ways to interpret it. It's assembling images, or assembling content. And I think for me, it's not necessarily like it has to be collage. I think it's just...
Like you don't have to use glue even.
No,
right?
Exactly. And I think it's more a conceptual underpinning of how gathering information, whether it's visual or sound or physical, like I think, or 3D, like I think this idea of like compositing something, it doesn't have to be called a collage anymore. It's just, I think it's just art.
Yeah. Interesting, because the idea of perforation, right?
Right.
That's just about like kind of weakening a join.
Yes.
But that's still certainly within the practice. Yeah.
Yeah, and this idea that when you're cutting something, like what are you removing? That also, those empty spaces are also interesting to me.
Yeah.
As much as the image. Yeah.
I feel so certain that I've forgotten the central point. Is there anything,
Anything left to say about the?
something that you're dying to? Well, I'm actually curious. This might be too personal, just tell me. But as a Senegalese community has grown in Winnipeg, has your father been able to join them? I'm thinking about the Jewish diaspora that led my people to Montreal in 2 phases, and they kind of don't. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I think for sure my father, well, he was at the University of St. Boniface. At the time, he was the dean at one point. And I think one of his mandates was to try and bring people from French-speaking countries from Africa to come study there. And I think that had a big effect on the Senegalese community. He also, like, three of his brothers came after his arrival. And now I think, he's definitely part of that community, and the community is definitely aware of his, his efforts to welcome Senegalese and all these and into the community. So I think that's a yes to that.
Great.
Yeah.
And he hasn't found anybody who was there before him yet.
I mean, I'll have to ask him again, but I think I think it wasn't even that he was the first Senegalese. I think he was saying, like, he couldn't meet anyone. There was very few people from Africa or Western Africa specifically. There was I think he said, there was some people that he knew from, like, specifically to who he knows. I'm sure there was lots, but in his world at that time, he was like, there was barely anyone.
A world is true too, a person's world. I mean, and Alyssa said that was the impetus as she came to Brandon. And
right.
It's like, where's all my Black history, right?
Right,
and found it. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to check real quick in case I missed one. Okay. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming all the way down to Brandon and visiting the space finally, and we hope to have you back. You've been here before as far as your work. And now again. So thank you so much, and Binta.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to talk about my work, so thank you.
Great. Okay, and thanks for joining us online.
Thank you.
You have until November 30th to see this exhibition in person. Share widely, come often. Thanks.
Thank you.